touch with the show. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode, suggest a case, or request a shout out, you can find What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight on social media. You can follow and message the podcast on X and Blue Sky. Just search at What They Hide Pod on both. You can also email the show directly, whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. The details will be in the episode description. I read every message, and I really appreciate you taking the time to reach out. In today's episode, we look at a different type of monster from a different country. Okay, let's crack on with the show. There is a sound you never forget once you've heard it. Not a scream, not an alarm, a door closing, heavy, solid, intentional. And then the sound that follows it. Nothing. No wind, no traffic, no birds, just air that does not move. In the Austrian town of Amstetten, there was a house that stood quietly among others. Green walls, flower boxes in the windows, a tidy driveway, a man who waved to neighbours. If you walked past it on Elisabeth in the 1990s, you would not stop. You wouldn't stare. You wouldn't feel afraid. Because it did not look like the setting of a crime. It looked like retirement. It looked like stability. It looked like normal. Inside that house lived Josef Fritzl, a husband, a father, a landlord, a man who had spent decades working as an electrical engineer. He collected rent. He maintained his property. He attended social gatherings. He complained about bureaucracy, like everyone else. He did not look unhinged. He did not look chaotic. He looked disciplined, routine, controlled. And control, when it is quiet, is hard to detect. Beneath that house was a basement. Something else. Concrete walls, narrow corridors, steel doors reinforced with electronic locks. A space so carefully constructed that even those living above it did not enter. A space designed not to be discovered. For 24 years, life unfolded inside that hidden level. Birthdays passed, children grew. Time was measured not by sunlight, but by artificial bulbs. Not by seasons, but by the sound of a man's footsteps on the stairs. Above ground, Austria changed. Government shifted, technology evolved, the Berlin Wall fell. The world moved forward. Below ground, nothing moved at all. This is not a story about a single violent moment. It's a story about duration, about captivity stretched across decades, about a crime that did not erupt, but persisted, year after year, lock after lock, lie after lie, because sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not loud, they're systematic, they're maintained, they're hidden in routine. In 1984, a young woman named Elisabeth disappeared. Police were told she had run away. A letter appeared explaining she had joined a cult. The case did not become a national emergency. There were no helicopters circling, no mass searches. Life continued, but Elisabeth had not run away. She had been led down into the basement by her own father, and that door had closed. For the next 24 years, Josef Fritzl lived two lives. Upstairs, grandfather, husband, tenant manager. Downstairs, jailer. Upstairs, sunlight, newspapers, neighbours. downstairs. Concrete, silence, confinement. The distance between those two worlds was measured in meters, but it might as well have been galaxies. The town did not know, the wife did not claim to know. Social workers visited the home, police interacted with the family, children played upstairs, and beneath them, another family existed, hidden. Because the most dangerous thing about this case is not that it happened in secrecy, is that it happened within reach of ordinary life. What allows a man to sustain control for 24 years? What allows a community to miss what sits beneath? What does evil look like when it wears patience instead of rage? Tonight, we step inside the house on Ebestrasse, inside the basement, inside the psychology of control, and we ask the question that makes this story so deeply disturbing. How much horror can exist beneath normality before someone hears the door close? This is what they hide, hidden crimes in plain sight. And this is the story of Josef Fritzl. This episode contains discussion of prolonged captivity, sexual abuse, incest, child abuse, and the death of an infant. The themes are deeply disturbing and may be distressing for some listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you want to understand what happened in that basement, you have to start long before the door closed. Josef Fritzl was born in 1935 in Austria, a country still recovering from war, rebuilding identity, reconstructing order. His father was imprisoned during much of his childhood. His mother, by multiple accounts later shared with journalists, was strict, controlling, dominant. We must be careful here. Many people grow up in strict homes and do not become criminals. But environment shapes perception. Control can be learned. Control can be admired. Control can feel like safety. By the 1950s, Josef Fritzl had crafted a life that appeared disciplined. He married Rosemary in 1956. They would have 7 children. He worked as an electrical engineer, a profession built on systems, wiring, circuits, precision. Colleagues described him as competent, practical, methodical, but there were fractures beneath the surface. In 1967, Fritzl was convicted of rape. He served approximately 18 months in prison. Later, he was convicted of indecent assault. These were not minor offences, they were violent sexual crimes, and yet after serving his sentence he returned to family life. He resumed work. He resumed fatherhood. The community did not exile him. He folded back into normality. And here lies the first psychological tension. A man capable of sexual violence was allowed to re-enter a private, domestic environment with children. No monitoring, no long-term supervision, no systematic safeguard beyond the assumption that punishment equals reform. Multiple reports from extended family and acquaintances later described Josef as authoritarian at home, strict rules, rigid expectations. He was said to have demanded obedience. Again, strict parenting does not equal criminal intent, but dominance is a pattern, and patterns rarely appear only once. In interviews after the crimes were revealed, one of his sons described him as controlling and feared, a man who decided, a man who expected compliance, a man who did not tolerate defiance. Control was not just behaviour, it was identity. There is something deeply unsettling about offenders who maintain functional public lives, because chaos would be easier to detect. But Fritzl was not chaotic. He paid taxes, he renovated property, he collected rent, he maintained appearances. Psychologists often refer to this as compartmentalization, the ability to divide life into sealed emotional chambers. Above ground, husband, father, engineer. Below ground, something else. But that ability did not appear overnight in 1984. It had been rehearsed for decades. The prior convictions show that he already possessed sexual entitlement, capacity for violence, and the ability to continue living normally after harming someone. That combination is rare but dangerous. Elisabeth Fritzl was born in 1966. She grew up in a house where authority was not questioned. In adolescence, tensions reportedly grew between her and her father. Teenage rebellion is normal, but rebellion inside a rigid authoritarian structure can feel threatening to the authority figure. In August 1984, Elisabeth was 18 years old, legally an adult, old enough to leave home, old enough to challenge control. And this is the moment where psychology sharpens, because control that is absolute does not tolerate independence. If dominance defines you, losing dominance feels like annihilation. On August the 28th, 1984, Fritzl told Elisabeth to help him carry a door into the basement. A practical request, an ordinary chore. She followed him downstairs. What happened next is not dramatised here. It is documented in court. He overpowered her, he restrained her, and he locked the door. But to understand that moment, you have to understand what it represented. It was not spontaneous rage. The basement had already been modified, doors reinforced, locks installed, soundproofing added. He had prepared the space. Preparation transforms impulse into intention. Days later, a letter appeared, written in Elisabeth's handwriting. It claimed she had run away to join a cult. It asked her parents not to look for her. Police investigated. There was no sign of forced entry, no body, no immediate evidence of foul play. The letter persuaded them. The case cooled, but here is the chilling detail. The letter was dictated by Josef Fritzl. He forced Elisabeth to write it. He mailed it himself. He manipulated authority with paperwork. This is the pattern again. Control, not only of bodies, but narrative. He did not simply imprison her. He rewrote reality above ground. Imagine the house in the days after her disappearance. Rosemary reportedly believed her daughter had left willingly. Siblings believed their sister had chosen another life. Grief, but no funeral. Absence, but no body. The family continued. Dinner at the table, bedrooms intact. One empty space explained away by a letter. And beneath them, Elisabeth remained. This is where the story shifts from crime to captivity, because what began as abduction became architecture. Time became a weapon. Isolation became strategy. And upstairs, life went on. The most haunting part of this transition is not the violence, it is the ordinariness that followed. Josef went to work. He mowed the lawn. He greeted neighbours. He descended into the basement at night. And for 24 years, no one forced the door. The disappearance of Elisabeth Fritzl was not a headline that shook Austria. It was a local event. A teenager who ran away. A father who expressed frustration. a letter that explained enough to satisfy. And that is how some of the longest crimes begin. Not with explosion, but with explanation. Next, we descend fully into the basement, into the years below, into a world where childhood unfolded without sunlight, and where control became total. There is a difference between being alone and being contained. Alone implies space, containment doesn't. The concealed basement beneath the Fritzl home was not discovered for 24 years. Not because it was invisible, but because it was engineered not to be imagined. It was hidden behind shelving, behind a heavy reinforced door, behind another locked steel barrier. Access required codes, multiple keys, and permission from one man. The ceilings were low, just over 5 feet in some sections. The air was circulated through pipes installed by Fritzl himself. Artificial light marked day and night, except day and night meant nothing, because there were no windows, no sunrise, no dusk. Time became abstract. When Elisabeth was first locked inside in August 1984, she was 18 years old, legally an adult, psychologically still forming. The first nights underground were reportedly spent chained, threatened, isolated. Fritzl told her no one would hear her. He told her if she tried to escape, he would gas the room. He told her he had wired explosives into the structure. Isolation plus fear is powerful architecture. You don't need to prove the bomb exists. You only need the victim to believe it does. In captivity, time does not move forward. It circles. Without sunlight, your body loses rhythm. Sleep fractures. Memory blurs. Days do not have edges. Weeks do not have markers. Elisabeth would later tell investigators that she marked time by the behaviour of her captor. When he descended, when he left, when lights were turned off, when food was delivered. Time was no longer measured by calendars, it was measured by footsteps. 4 years after her imprisonment, Elisabeth gave birth to her first child underground. No doctor, no sterile equipment, no emergency support. Fritzl reportedly bought books on childbirth. He provided basic supplies and left her to endure. Over the next decade, 6 more pregnancies followed. 7 births in total. Each child entered a world without sky, without trees, without distance. 3 of those children would remain underground. They learned to crawl on concrete floors, learned to speak inside walls, learned that the universe was no larger than a corridor. Here is the part that grips the heart. Elisabeth did not collapse. She became a mother. Under conditions designed to break her, she built structure, created lessons. She described birds to children who had never heard one. She described rain to children who had never felt it. She described the sky as blue, even though the only blue they saw came from television screens. She reportedly hung drawings on walls, artificial decoration to simulate normalcy. Children drew windows, they drew houses, they drew sunlight. Imagine teaching your child about something they cannot experience. Imagine explaining wind without ever feeling it yourself for decades. That is not just survival, it is resistance. The basement was beneath a lived-in home. The children underground sometimes heard movement upstairs, voices, television, life happening. They were not buried in wilderness, they were beneath routine. Freedom existed directly above their heads. The proximity is what makes this case psychologically suffocating. They were not miles away from society, they were meters away and unreachable. Upstairs, 3 of Elisabeth's children were raised publicly as foundlings. Josef Fritzl claimed Elisabeth had abandoned them. He produced letters. Authorities accepted them. The babies were enrolled in school. Neighbours saw them playing in the yard. Meanwhile, below ground, siblings lived in artificial night. One set of children learned traffic rules. The other learned silence. The psychological dissonance here is profound. Josef Fritzl did not isolate himself from society. He integrated. He attended community events. He hosted tenants. Then he descended. 2 households, 1 man controlling both. One of the underground children was born in 1994. By the time she was rescued in 2008, she was 14 years old. 14 years without natural light. Medical reports later described severe vitamin deficiencies, limited physical development, an immune system shaped by confinement. But the most devastating detail is conceptual. She did not know how large the world was. Imagine stepping out at 14 and realizing the sky is infinite. The sensory overload would be terrifying, not freeing. One infant, born prematurely in 1996, died shortly after birth. Fritzl later described disposing of the baby's body in a furnace. It is one of the darkest details in the case, but what chills more than the fact itself is what followed. Life continued. There was no public mourning, no police inquiry, no certificate, a life erased without record. And below ground, silence returned. Control was not random. Fritzl reportedly dictated when lights were on and off, controlled access to the television, controlled temperature, controlled food supply, and controlled contact between upstairs and downstairs children. He had constructed not just a prison, but a closed ecosystem. And ecosystems, once sealed, sustain themselves. We talk about the beginning, we talk about the rescue, but the most haunting part of this case is the middle, the ordinary years, 1991, 1992, 1993, years where nothing dramatic happened, no discovery, no escape attempt that succeeded, just endurance. Imagine Christmas underground, birthdays underground, arguments, adolescence, all within walls that never moved. The monotony of captivity can be more psychologically crushing than violence, because monotony removes the illusion that something might change. And yet, something in Elisabeth did not surrender. She taught, she structured, she waited for something she could not predict. The system might have continued another year, another decade, if not for illness. Kirsten's collapse in 2008 was not an escape attempt, it was a medical emergency. Fate intervened where law enforcement had not. If she had not fallen unconscious, if doctors had not questioned, the door might still be locked. That is what makes this case unbearable. It was not brilliant detective work. It was accident. And sometimes survival depends on accident. For 24 years, the house on Ebestraße contained 2 realities, one visible, one buried. The visible one attended school events, paid taxes, smiled at neighbours. The buried one marked time by footsteps and waited. What happened next would shock not only Austria, but the world. Because when the door finally opened, the light did not feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. April 2008. A 19-year-old girl named Kirsten lies unconscious in a hospital bed. She's never been in a hospital before. Her medical condition confuses doctors. Severe illness, no medical records, no history. They ask, where is her mother? Josef Fritzl produces another letter, handwritten, explaining absence. Doctors hesitate. Something doesn't fit. Kirsten's physical condition suggests prolonged deprivation of sunlight, nutritional irregularities, isolation. Doctors alert authorities, and for the first time in 24 years, pressure builds in a direction Josef Fritzl cannot control. Under scrutiny and fear and exposure, Fritzl does something he has never done. He brings Elisabeth upstairs. He brings the remaining basement children with her. Imagine that moment. After 24 years underground, Elisabeth steps into open air. The sky is not abstract anymore. It is vast. The light is not soft. It is blinding. Witnesses later describe the children shielding their eyes. The world was too large, too loud, too unpredictable. Freedom is not gentle when you have never experienced it. It's overwhelming. Police separate Fritzl from his family. They question him. At first he denies, he minimises, he reframes. But inconsistencies stack quickly. The story fractures. Confronted with mounting evidence, he begins to confess. Calmly, not emotionally, methodically. And then officers are taken to the house. Investigators enter the Fritzl home on Ebestrasse. They directed toward the basement. At first glance it appears ordinary. Concrete, storage shelves, tools, nothing that screams atrocity. Then a shelf is moved. Behind it, a reinforced steel door. Not typical domestic installation. Industrial, heavy. It requires multiple unlocking steps. Keys, codes, procedure. This is not improvisation, this is engineering. The first door opens, a second barrier appears, then a third, each one narrowing space, each one reducing light, each one amplifying silence. Officers later describe the air as stale, heavy, artificial, and then they enter. What they find is not a cinematic dungeon. It is worse. It is lived in. Beds with blankets, a small kitchen area, children's drawings on walls, a refrigerator humming, a toilet, television cables running through concrete. This is not a temporary holding space. It is a functioning underground apartment below a suburban family home. Occupied for 24 years. There is something uniquely disturbing about domestic horror, because it suggests routine. Meals were cooked here, lessons were taught here, children grew here. All while upstairs another life unfolded normally. Officers realise they're standing in a space where birthdays passed, where arguments happened, where adolescence unfolded without sky. The scale of time hits before the scale of crime. 24 years, not days, not months, a generation. Officers are trained. They see violence. They see trauma. But this is different. This is duration. The basement is not chaotic. It's organised, which means it was maintained, which means it was intentional, which means it was sustainable. And that realisation lands heavily. News breaks quickly. Austria is stunned. International media descend. The quiet town of Amstetten becomes synonymous with horror. Neighbours speak to reporters. I had no idea. He seemed normal. He was strict. None of them imagined this. And imagination has limits. Fritzl operated beneath those limits. March 2009, St. Pölten, Austria. The courthouse is surrounded by media vans. Satellite dishes stretch toward the sky. Reporters speak in hushed urgency. The world has arrived. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere is not chaotic. It is controlled, measured, quiet. At the centre of the room sits Josef Fritzl, 73 years old. Grey hair, thick glasses, neutral expression. He does not look like a cinematic villain. He looks like a retired engineer, which of course he is. And that's part of what makes this so unsettling. The indictment reads like something fictional, but it isn't. Josef Fritzl is charged with rape, incest, coercion, enslavement, murder by negligence for the infant who died, and deprivation of liberty. Those are legal terms, but stripped of language, here is what they mean. He imprisoned his daughter for 24 years. He repeatedly assaulted her. He fathered 7 children with her. He controlled every aspect of her existence. And he built a prison beneath his home. And one of the children born in that prison died. The courtroom does not dramatise this. It dissects it. Elisabeth does not appear publicly. She testifies behind closed doors, shielded from cameras, protected by law. The courtroom listens. Her account is described later in reporting as steady, detailed, controlled, not theatrical, which makes it more devastating. She speaks of the first night, of the chains, of the threats that he would gas the chamber if she tried to escape. She speaks of the births, of holding newborns in a room with no windows, of teaching her children what sunlight was, without having seen it herself in decades. There is no screaming in the courtroom, there is silence, because some stories do not need volume to devastate. While she speaks, Josef Fritzl sits meters away. Observers later describe him as calm, occasionally taking notes, occasionally adjusting his glasses. No visible breakdown, no collapse into tears. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't deny loudly. He listens. And that stillness becomes the most chilling part of the trial. Because most people, when confronted with the consequences of their actions laid bare, fracture. He doesn't fracture. He compartmentalizes, even now. Prosecutors present architectural plans of the basement, blueprints, measurements, photographs of reinforced steel doors, details of electronic locking systems. This was not improvisation, this was planning. The domestic home retrofitted with industrial level containment. He applied for permits in earlier phases of basement renovation. He expanded gradually, each door heavier than the last, each layer more secure. To the normal listener, here's what that means. This was not an emotional explosion. This was engineering. It required time, money, deliberation, and the patience to maintain it for nearly a quarter of a century. DNA testing confirms what the world already suspects. Josef Fritzl is the biological father of Elisabeth's children. There is no ambiguity. Science closes any possible narrative loophole. The courtroom no longer debates if, it debates responsibility. One of the most harrowing parts of the trial concerns the baby who died in 1996. Born prematurely in the basement without medical assistance, the prosecution argues that Fritzl's failure to seek medical help contributed to the infant's death. This forms the basis for the murder by negligence charge. In court, Fritzl initially denies responsibility for that child's death. He suggests it was unavoidable, but evidence mounts, and slowly his legal strategy changes. Midway through proceedings, Josef Fritzl changes his plea. He pleads guilty to all charges. Why? Legal analysts later suggest the evidence was overwhelming. By admitting guilt, he may have hoped to avoid indefinite psychiatric detention. But the court is not swayed by strategy. He is found legally sane, fully aware of his actions, capable of understanding right from wrong. That finding is crucial, because it tells us this was not psychotic break, not delusion, not hallucination. It was sustained conscious control. Court-appointed psychiatrists describe Fritzl as having a severe personality disorder, dominant, manipulative, emotionally detached. They do not describe him as insane. They describe him as someone who believed he had the right to control, who justified his behaviour internally, who constructed a moral framework in which his needs superseded others. He reportedly stated during interrogation that he saw himself as the master of the situation. The word master echoes because it captures the core of the case. This was not random violence, it was ownership in his mind. During sentencing, observers search his face for something: shame, grief, collapse. What they describe instead is composure. He reportedly says he regrets his actions. But regret delivered without visible emotional shift feels clinical, mechanical, detached. And that detachment disturbs people more than rage would, because rage can be understood as impulse. Detachment suggests system. Josef Fritzl is sentenced to life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric institution in Austria. This means he will likely never be released. He will live out his remaining years in confinement. Irony is unavoidable. A man who built a prison now resides in one. But prisons do not restore lost decades. They do not restore childhood. They do not return sunlight to years spent without it. Austria grapples with shame. How did authorities accept the letters? How did social services miss warning signs? How did neighbours hear nothing? Investigations reveal bureaucratic failures, assumptions made, questions not pursued deeply enough, but the truth remains uncomfortable. Even perfect systems struggle to imagine what they cannot conceive. And Josef Fritzl operated beneath imagination. For the normal listener, here is what this trial represents. It is not just a legal reckoning. It is the moment when private horror becomes public knowledge, when secrecy collapses, when a hidden world is forced into daylight, and daylight is unforgiving. In that courtroom, two realities faced each other. One, a woman who lost her adulthood underground. The other, a man who maintained two lives without visible fracture. One marked time by footsteps, the other marked time by routine, and when the verdict was read, the law closed its chapter. But the psychological questions remain open. How does someone sustain control for 24 years? How does compartmentalization become a lifestyle? And how many other doors exist in this world that no one thinks to open? Next, we enter the aftermath, not the headlines, but the long, quiet work of rebuilding. Because survival does not end with rescue. It begins there. When the door opened, nothing about the world felt gentle. Rescue is not relief, it is shock. For 24 years, Elisabeth's world had dimensions, measured in meters, walls on every side, ceilings that pressed downward, light that could be switched off by someone else. Then suddenly, there was sky, endless, uncontained, no ceiling, no walls. For someone raised in confinement, space is not comforting, it is destabilizing. Imagine the first night Elisabeth slept in a room with windows. Imagine lying in a bed where light leaks through curtains, where sound travels freely, cars passing, wind in the trees, doors closing somewhere distant. The body, conditioned to silence and enclosure, would not trust that openness. Freedom feels exposed at first, because safety in captivity is predictability, and predictability had been concrete walls. One of the children reportedly asked why the sky did not end. How do you answer that? How do you explain infinity to someone raised inside a box? Doctors described the children as sensitive to light, skin pale from absence of sun, eyes adjusting slowly. The first time grass touched their feet, it was unfamiliar. The first time wind moved their hair, it was startling. The first time rain fell on their skin, it may have felt unreal. These are moments most of us forgot before we can remember. For them, they were firsts. In adolescence, that is devastating. Not because of spectacle, but because of absence. The absence of childhood milestones, the absence of ordinary experience, the absence of years that cannot be restored. We often focus on beginnings and endings, the abduction, the rescue, but the true devastation of this case lives in the middle. The years no one saw, 1992, 1993, 1994. Years when the world above changed, technology advanced, children graduated, families travelled. Below ground, life did not move forward. It repeated. Meals, lessons, confinement. It is the monotony that unsettles most deeply, because monotony means this was sustainable. This was not chaos, it was system, and systems are harder to dismantle. Recovery didn't mean forgetting, it meant relearning. Learning how to walk into a grocery store without panic, learning how to trust doors that close but do not lock you in, learning how to speak to strangers without fear of punishment. Elisabeth reportedly became the architect of her family's new life. She chose privacy, she rejected interviews, she refused to let her trauma become public currency. In doing so, she reclaimed something fundamental: agency. For 24 years her choices had been stripped. Now even silence was her choice, and that matters. The children began school. Some for the first time. They learned geography and discovered the world was not just their country but continents. They learned about oceans, about mountains, about cities larger than imagination. Each new concept must have felt like discovering an entirely new layer of reality. But discovery does not erase trauma. Therapists worked patiently, helping them understand boundaries, helping them understand that control over their bodies was theirs now, helping them understand that the world, though large, was not entirely dangerous. Recovery is not cinematic. It is incremental. A step outside without fear. A night's sleep without panic. A door that closes and stays unlocked. There is something uniquely cruel about crimes measured in decades. Violence is devastating, but duration compounds it. Every year underground was a year stolen. Every season unseen was a memory that never formed. The children born in captivity lost their earliest understanding of freedom. Elisabeth lost her 20s, her 30s, nearly all of her adulthood. Time is the one thing no justice system can return, and that is what leaves listeners unsettled, because punishment feels small against 24 years. There is also this uncomfortable truth. If Kirsten had not fallen ill in 2008, if doctors had accepted another letter, if no one had asked one more question, the basement might still be closed. The fragility of rescue is what devastates most. Freedom hinged on illness, on suspicion, on a doctor who did not settle for explanation. Justice did not begin with brilliance. It began with doubt. The house on Ebestrasse did not crumble. It did not burn. It did not collapse under the weight of what it contained. It stood, ordinary, paint intact, garden maintained, windows cleaned, and beneath it, for 24 years, a world existed that no one imagined. That is the part that lingers. Not just what he did, but how it stayed hidden. Not in wilderness, not in isolation, but within reach of neighbours, within earshot of passing cars, within a town that carried on. Josef Fritzl did not hide in darkness. He hid in routine. He hid in the assumption that someone else would notice. He hid in paperwork, in letters, in the belief that this could not possibly be happening here. And that belief is the most dangerous concealment of all. Because when something is unimaginable, it becomes invisible. This is why we tell these stories, not to relive horror, not to sensationalize suffering, but to examine concealment, to understand how systems fail when they assume too much, how communities overlook because normality feels safer than suspicion, and how the line between ordinary and unimaginable can be thinner than we want to admit. Elisabeth survived. Her children survived. That survival is quiet, private, not for us to consume, but to respect. And yet the years remain, 24 of them, unseen sunlight, unfelt rain, uncelebrated birthdays. Time does not return. It only moves forward, and so must they. And so must we. The house still stands, but the door that mattered has been opened. The question that remains is harder. How many other doors exist that we never think to check? This has been What They Hide, hidden crimes in plain sight. And sometimes what's hidden isn't buried in darkness. It's built beneath normal life.